For those who don't know me, I'm Rob Barton, and I'm the co-director for Social Science and Health at the Institute of Advanced Study. And it's my honour to introduce this morning's speaker. I hope everybody's had some breakfast or at least some coffee. For those in the UK, it's a bit early. For Anna, I gather it's a lovely day and she's got a view over the sea in Genoa, so I'm very envious this morning. But welcome to Anna Stagno, who is a post-medieval and rural archaeologist at the University of Genoa. And she's working on the IAS project Negotiating Landscapes of Rights, of Law. We don't do lengthy or formal introductions for these seminars, so without further ado, I think I will pass back to Ronan to organise the sharing of screens, and likewise, and to Anna to tell us what she's going to be talking about this morning.
And yes, I give as the title of my seminar, well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you to the IAS for organizing all this difficult term, because I think we are living in a very strange time, and to be able to create occasion to meet is always, even if online, is very, very important. And I also want to say thank you to Chris Gerrard, Henry Jones, and to all the negotiating landscape of rights team, because we are having a very, very interesting discussion, and we are finding many connections between our research that are very, very different. And to help, to contribute, to go forward in the reflection, and also to try to offer to all the IAS fellow and all the IAS group some element of reflection and discussion, I decided to speak about some general concept, but for starting from my particular perspective, that is the study of the rural spaces. And the title I gave to my seminar, that is De-urbanising rural spaces, the word we use and the interpretation of the past is well, is inspired by the post-colonial thinking, because I think that in the same time in which there was, and in archaeology, mainly in classical archaeology, it helped to make a significant advance in the comprehension of the Roman period and the Greek period, but also in the study of the rural spaces, as the post-colonial thinking, and so the consideration that there was an interpretation of some historical process too much drive by the Western Europe thinking and by the idea of a dominant culture considering a distance between culture as a fact, and so this kind of thinking changed with the post-colonial thinking. I think there is the same need to de-urbanize the study of the rural areas, because there are too much areas of our understanding of the past and also of the present and of the current processes around the rural areas that are still dominated by external categories that are not inherent to rural spaces, and by this distance between researcher and researched, that in many cases, and with the researcher I mean the people who study rural areas, or the people who contribute to the planning to rural areas and researched are rural areas. I think that there is a need to make a deep reflection on to which extent our categories drive what we understand and how we consider and we define the object of our investigation. And I will try to do it. I have organized my paper in more or less in three parts. The first one is considering how the categories we use deeply influence our interpretation of the past, and so thinking about the need to decolonize the way to our way to think rural areas. And the second is focus on a process I have already highlighted in my previous talk, that is to follow in which way the jurisdictional dimension of the action progressively was excluded by the institutional consideration of rural areas and local actors' activities. And what I have defined the illusion of the reality, because we have many representations of rural spaces, but they are just representation, not the reality. And then I would like to going a little bit forward, thinking on the reflection of these urban thinking or rural areas in the question of the heritage. And so to which extent the externalization of the conservation of the heritage is related to this dominating urban thinking. And with the externalization of the conservation of the heritage, I mean that the conservation, at least in Italy, of the heritage do not depend by local people, but by the decision of some institution, of some central institution. And to conclude, I would like to give another some elements of optimism, like in the paper of Nicole, and so to give some spot on some current processes that are changing the perspective and consider it, and starting to consider before the rural perspective. And so how this could be a way to overcome the distance and to change our consideration. And I would like to start with the categories and to try to explain what I have already said from two monographs that appear in the same year. And I have selected this example from many possible because these monographs in an incidental way speak about the same areas, and so not permanently cultivated rural areas, but from two different perspectives that are very, very distant. In one, the title of the monograph was Uncultivated Lands, and in the other was Temporary Cultivation. And the subtitle was the appropriation of the land in the medieval and modern Europe. And considering what I say, that the colonial perspective, we could say that in this, and what emerged from reading the papers, is that in this one, the cadastral categories, and so the categories used by the researcher, by us in the present, are the ones that are used to decipher the past. And so they speak about, cultivated and uncultivated open areas and woodland, while in in the second monograph that was made not only by archaeologists, but also by social historians, both for medieval and modern period, they use the categories of sources. So they speak about wooded pasture, grazed woodlands, and temporary cultivation. And so what is very visible is from one side, the multiple uses that in these monographs are a little bit hid, but above all, the jurisdictional dimension of the action that is very evident from this term appropriation, because the practices, as I have already said in my previous talk, are a way to appropriate the space, to claim possession and jurisdiction. And if we use cadastral categories, these dimensions disappear. And what disappear is the perspective of the local actors. And so we lose, using external categories and what I say colonial perspective that is the same, we lose to consider the local dynamics and the interpretation of the space as realized by the people who were living. And so what I want to stress is that is this concept that I have already said, that is we have always to keep in mind that the meaning we give to the object of our investigation depends largely, but mainly, maybe exclusively, from the categories we adopt. And for the reason is very, very important to not forget the contextualization of our categories and to try to not use external ones. And this is an example of the possibility to use the jurisdictional perspective. This is wet meadows inside an area of pastures, but it is also a private plot inside common lands. And so we could also think about it, to interpret it as an usurpation of a part of common land, to understand why it was usurped, was privatized. And I think in this way we could pass from a simple inventory of the past evidence in the study of the landscape to consider landscapes as we said in the title of our project, landscape of rights. And so the stratification not only of actions to produce something, but also of social relationships, and so of rights and negotiation of rights, but also of the stratification of memories around the uses and the claiming of the rights and so on. And it is possible, and we go a little bit forward, moving from archaeology and to the establishment of the distance between researcher and researched, and so the urban-centered perspective. We could follow this change in considering the maps around jurisdictional conflicts. These are forum maps that speak about the same problem, that are jurisdictional conflicts around common lands. But what is the big difference? That in this one, that is the first, the 20th century, is that the representatives, the geometra Billy, used the local perspective just to identify the plot that were controversial. But then he used the cadastral categories to define this plot, to describe them, that he took from the cadastral map. In this map that are from the 17th and the 18th century, the meaning of the spaces that are represented largely depend by the description of the local actors that were making the controversy around their rights. And this is very interesting because the meaning of this map depends by the testimonies of the local actors. In this case, the meaning is the one that geometrability want to give. And this is an ecastic way to see how changed the institutional perspective. And this shift from the sharing of a language between institutions and local actors and the establishment of another level of culture, the people who could decide and describe the reality and the other that are more passive. And this is something very interesting because it is not only a difference between, well, we could consider this change of perspective from in the dialogue between institution and local people also like an interruption of a dialogue. But this interruption of dialogue, so of a social relationship, it is not only something that occurs between local actors and the institution, but also between generations. In fact, one of the possibility of archaeology is to bring to light past meaning of material culture, of structure that were forgotten because their function was not more useful. This is the case of some structure in these pastoral areas used at least from the 16th century. And these are small stone pits that were built during the 19th century in a period in which this area was alienated because they before were common lands and then they became private plots in the process of privatization of common lands. And what is interesting that local people say that they are just stone pits to clean the pastures from stones. But what we realized, mapping them, analyzing them, that the ones that are small structures in dry stone walls are all aligned along the slope, and maybe they define spaces. Maybe not with the jurisdictional meaning, but surely a way to divide the space for some function that was a meaning that was completely forgotten by the last users. And this opens us a clue to a more complex function about these structures, also other that are used as to prevent soil erosion, but now this function is completely forgotten. And I think that this one, the archaeology, so could help to reconnect the dialogue that are interrupted. And this theme of the dialogue, and I go quickly to at the end of my seminar, is something that is very, very important because during the last century, many processes contribute to the interruption of dialogue between generations due to modernization. And so what was important before, that was the local knowledge and its transmission, became unuseful. And it is something that elderly people are still living and they feel unuseful. It is a frustrating feeling because they know that they have many things to say, but nobody want to hear them, want to learn from them. And what is interesting for me, that I am an archaeologist, that the archaeological study show that the changes in practices, and so the interruption of the transmission about some some function, like in this case, that what we lose is the ability to excavate and impermeabilize open channels for irrigation purpose, and it became unuseful with the polyethylene pipe. This interruption many times precede and not follow, and so the abandonment of the uses precede and not follow the abandonment and the depopulation processes. And it is something that I think is necessary to think about. And this is another way, in this case, between generations to establish a distance, a dominant culture, and another one that could be deleted. In this case, is the local knowledge. And this is something that, is very important to consider if we consider the question of the heritage. This is a channel that maybe was made during the 16th century, and it is completely abandonment, and it is becoming destroyed. And this is something that needs a deeper reflection. But this is also a problem of how we consider the past in our heritageization processes. This is a map of the Ligurian terraces, but what they represent are just the visible terraces at the present, not the historical terraces, that they are excluded because they are no more visible, but they still exist in the ground. And this is something very important to consider, because if you, in many cases, if you are not in a map like this terraced, chestnut terraced, you are excluded by many measures related to the heritage conservation. And so, or to the, but there is also another problem that arises from this, from the question of the heritage, that is what I have mentioned before, so the externalization of the heritage conservation, because now who decide what is heritage and how to preserve heritage are not local people, but local communities, and local communities, but are, at least in Italy, external institution, both for the naturalistic heritage and for the landscape and cultural heritage. And what this inventory around the Italian rural landscapes showed us is that the protected areas are more abandoned than the not protected ones. These inventories was about Italian rural landscape of historical interest and was promoted by the Minister of Agriculture. So the idea was not to promote the process of heritageization in terms of protection, but in terms of uses. And what emerged that the problem of protected areas, of protected landscapes, is that they contribute to the abandonment. I think there is a relationship between this question of the externalization, of who decide what to do about heritage. And it is a problem also about the categories we use, and this question of the protection of the abandonment, what is bringing to is to the destruction of our heritage. This is a 15th century rural house that is completely destroyed. And to conclude, to give some idea to connect this fragmented thinking, is that there are processes in which the and the current situation in which the local perspective is taken account. And so the new dialogues at the paritatic level are building. And this is an example from Sierra Nevada, where young archaeologists are helping local people in Sierra Nevada to reopen the water channels for irrigation purpose that during the 60s and the 70s and the 80s were replaced with polyethylene pipe, and now they decided that it is better to come to open channels also because there is a shared work that is also an occasion of dialogue and also an occasion to make communities. So I think that there are many, this is just an example of how the post-colonial or post-urbaning thinking is coming in rural areas and in this study. And so I hope to not be too much confused and to have give some useful element for the discussion, to reflection for the discussion. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Anna, for an interesting start to the day. While people are thinking, perhaps I'll take advantage of my position. So, yeah, I can see to some extent the diagnosis of the problem here, the ways in which our categories define the object of our research, create distance between researcher and researched, and the kind of appropriation of the object of research. And I understand in general the call that you're making, I think I do, for a more perhaps, allow more local perspectives to enter into the framing of our questions and so forth. But can you say a little bit more about what you mean more specifically about how that works? Who do you speak to, for example? Who do you, if you don't just come in and do sort of parachute research where you come in and employ your categories and your concepts and go away again, but you enter into some kind of dialogue and have an approach that more, I don't know, respects the local issues, perspectives. I mean, what does that actually look like, and how do you choose who you decide to speak to? And obviously one has to have some kind of concepts and categories. So how does one reinvent those in practice?
Okay, thank you so much for Rob, for your interesting question. Yes, the question is in the study of the past to not invent, create new categories, but to try, and we could do it for medieval and post-medieval period, but as archaeologists and philologists show us also for a classical period, to try to understand how the space, the world was categorized by the people who live there. And so, for example, for what I studied, the landscape, if we consider that as in the present, it is possible only or to permanently cultivate lands or to have a woodland and pasture, we have not in mind that it is possible to use the same plot for cultivate in some period of in some years, and then to use it as pastures in some other in a part of the year, and then to make hay in the same plot, and then to have something like a woodland in some during some years, because the woodland grow, and so until I don't cut their branches, they became like a woodland. And so this, if I have not in mind that it is possible to use the same plot in different ways, I don't think it, and I do not see it in my sources that are archaeological. And this is something that in many cases it is possible to note in the interpretation of an archaeobotanical sequence, that if you don't know that some agroforestry pastoral practices were possible, you don't see it, you don't see them. And so if we use present categories of land use to describe something that occurred 10 centuries ago, we make a mistake, because in 10th century, the management of the land changed in many times. And so also, if we do not consider that the private property and the property is a concept that derived, our concept of property is something that derived by the civil code of the 19th century, and before the concept of property was different, and we have to take it into consideration, because if not, we apply our vision of the present in the past. And in the same, for rural areas, what the dominant urban perspective consider rural areas not like places. I speak mostly about Italy and Southern Europe, because maybe in the UK it is something different. But for what concerns Italy, rural areas, mountain areas are places where you could go to make tourism, but not to live. And why not? If you, it is also a question of territorial justice. If you change the perspective and consider that maybe there are people that want to live there, then you have to make it possible the condition for people to live there. And so it is, in this case, how to consider the local perspective, to consider that they have the same rights of citizens, of people who live in town, to live in their places.
Yes, I suppose if I can just press you a little bit more on that. I understand what you're saying, but how do you do that in practice, and which locals? How do you decide which locals to speak to, for example? How does it actually work?
Chris Gerard maybe could say something to help me.
Okay, I put something in the chat there about what you're talking about around categorization of monuments, which I've discussed with Chris Dalgleish as well. It's an example, really. And what I'm saying here is in the 1960s, archaeologists in the United Kingdom defined upland settlements, temporary upland settlements, as sheilings, and excluded anything that had cultivation associated with it. And they were protected as such, as a separate category, and are still preserved today for that reason. But we now understand, of course, much better, in part from European examples like the ones you've been talking about in Italy, that upland settlement can shift from permanent to temporary, and from temporary to permanent. And these archaeological categories are a nonsense, really. But they have been extremely influential in the heritageization and the preservation of sites in Northern Britain. So that's just one example taken from the UK. There are others.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, the question is this, and how to decide. I am not sure to ever understand what you mean about, Rob, about how to decide or who decide what, because of course we are a researcher and we choose an object of our research. But the question is not to decide that we have the truth in our bag, and to be open to change our I am not sure to have said what I want to say.
That's fine.
Maybe I can help out a bit here, Rob, because anthropologists would normally approach a local community before working on their landscape in any way. And, you know, we have very, very well-established methods for figuring out the demographics and who to approach and the community structures, etc. So, you know, in many ways, what you're talking about is a norm for social anthropology, because even our ethical code wouldn't allow you to work in a community without establishing a relationship with that community and thinking about the benefits to that community and gaining the permission, if necessary, of that community. So I think there are sort of plenty of norms for, and I'm a little puzzled, Anna, because it seems to me that there must be quite a lot of variation internationally, because in so many parts of the world, it is now very much the norm for archaeologists and anthropologists to work with local communities in the way that you're proposing. But on the other hand, it is not necessarily the case that local communities will have in-depth historical knowledge about previous land uses in the way that you kind of hope that archaeologists will. So in a way, what you're asking for is better archaeology, rather than assuming that local communities will know what was being done with that place centuries ago, although they may have a lot of familiarity with the landscape itself and therefore the indicators of those things. So I think we'd all wholeheartedly get behind the notion of more work with local communities in that way, and of course in revealing very different local perspectives on what's happening now. And what springs to mind there, of course, is the work of people like Barbara Bender and her work with all the different groups who contend about Stonehenge, which, as you'll realize, is a very controversial site, but actually working with all those different perspectives as well, which is also important, because there's a question of representation, of who represents local community views as well. And of course, it's interesting because you come from a part of the world where Roman law of property was established really first, and it is that which guides contemporary notions of property. But I also want to just make a very quick comment about the use of maps, because it seems to me that there's some wonderful literature on comparing the versions of the world that appear in old maps. And I'm thinking particularly of Ben Orlov's work on Lake Titicaca, which is a lovely piece called Mapping Reads and Reading Maps, or maybe it's the other way around. But it looks at the way that the villagers map their villages, and then the way that the government, for purposes of government, map their villages. And so I would wholeheartedly encourage the use of archival mapping material in this way, because it is a map that actually makes visible what people value and how they see it, and it's enormously. And there's a tremendous literature also on alternative types of maps. So for example, we had a couple of fellows a few years ago, Howard and Francis Morphy, who work on Aboriginal art, and those of us who work in Australia know that these are also maps that map people and resources and history and usage and origin stories, and they have layers and layers and layers and layers of meanings. So I think it's also important to look beyond conventional mapping into other representational forms. But I think it's a tremendously fruitful area, particularly in terms of articulating earlier ways of thinking about rights, because Aboriginal art has been invaluable in establishing Aboriginal concepts of property and ownership. So I think that's also stuff very useful. And I just wanted to mention very briefly a project in Dorset that resonates very nicely with yours, which is archaeologists and local communities working together to reinstitute the old water meadows, which pertained in the 16th, 15th and 1600s, which was very important in terms of the local farming at the time. So more comments than questions really, but I hope that's helpful.
Oh yes, thank you, Veronica. Many comments and suggestions to continue, and I want to stress a question that is about heritage, and I agree that local people, in many cases, do not have the same consideration of us. But the question is, who, if they are the owners of that heritage, they should have a part in the decision about what to do about that heritage. And maybe it could be also to change many things, because the problem of monumentalization of the heritage, to fix it in a moment, is that people are expropriated by the process of conservation, while heritage is not conservation, is a dynamic process, the heritization, because heritage is an inheritance. We have to transmit it, but the transmission, it's also a way to change. And so I think we have a big problem in the heritagization processes, at least in Italy, that they want to fix something. But who could decide when and what? And so this is a point in which I think that we need post-colonial thinking, because we have to think again about heritage and what is, and this is, and maybe I always speak about Italy because here these processes are very evident, and I know them better, that in too much cases local people are excluded by the decision, and it is bringing to the abandonment of the space, not to the uses.
Anna, can I just take Chris's point a bit further? Hope my connection's okay. I think you're quite right. You do need to reframe or reorient your perspective to any terrain you're working in. Now, I work in uplands, not montane or sub-montane areas. And going back to Chris's point, agronomists, farmers, geographers would look at the intimate relationship between cultivated land and what we call open land. And I've got some questions about that I might come back to later. Because you can't have cultivation without manure. For manure, you need livestock. If you're going to keep livestock, you're going to be able to overwinter them, or some of them, for all sorts of reasons, breed stock and so on, in the next year. And straight away, you have to look at a much wider area than you normally would. You're just focusing on a site, like a shielding or a field system. A lot of that knowledge has been lost, but it hasn't all been lost. So if I talk to a farmer up in the Dales, they are still concerned about manure for a very particular reason. Hay is a very greedy crop. It eats more manure, animal manure, than cereals do. Now, once you start to understand that and unpick that kind of thinking, you can look at something like a shielding, look at its wider landscape, if you want to call it that, and understand the relationship between the open land and the cultivated land. In the way that you were hinting at and talking about Italy, that's not a common approach in archaeology still. I don't know what Chris would say about that. But it does also bring some question marks about how open landscapes actually were. Because if you've got a plot of, say, 3 acres, 1.5 hectares, you're going to need the equivalent of 12 sheep's manure for a year, or 3 cows. You can't have them on the land for all year. There's some agreement about the use of that open space and what your share of the tree hay, the risings you might dry for winter fodder, for the areas which you can cut the hay. And I think looking at some of the very early sketch maps of enclosures, what they were doing was simply formalising what existed then as hay, as pasture, as meadow, in the same way as they marked out areas for hefting and stinting on the open moor. So I've got some questions about how open landscapes actually were, but Chris is right. And so are you, that you've got to reframe your perspective and understand how this landscape works. There's still some of that understanding around at the moment, and you're quite right, you've got to talk to local people about it. But it's very challenging. And the archaeological record isn't as straightforward as actually digging a shielding and finding the structure. It's about understanding the environmental and geoarchaeology of the development of the soils. And again, that's not a well-developed area in most archaeology in the uplands. So thanks for the talk. I'd like to say, hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Perry. I am completely agree in the sense that many archaeologists are, and I think that is very interesting because pastoral archaeologist, mountain archaeology, in many cases is disconnected from agrarian archaeology, but historically they were complementary. because the terraces, the permanent cultivated areas, were used as a point of transhumance movement, and they need husbandry because they needed to be manured, as you said. And I think that forget the relationship between spaces inside the territory of the hamlets, and you said, but also in the long distance, uh, uh, do not help to interpret how the past dynamics and what happened in the past. And I think that in many times I read that common lands were marginal areas. Marginal? Are you sure that for a community common lands were marginal? And because they were the center of the life of the community, as clearly emerged by the conflicts in archival sources, but also from the organization, because as you say, it was not possible there was a rotation of cultures, of cultivation that was not, it is another way of our contemporary thinking to think that we live in a place and we stay all our life there, and to move outside is something that is difficult to do, but people before live in another way, and we do not consider the distance between us, the difficult for us to intend the past. And I think that we have to read in another way the sources to understand it. Well, social history and anthropology have made many things about it, but for us, for archaeologists, we have to work more to do it. I don't know if I understood what you say and if I say something useful for the discussion.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so the issue I wanted to raise is basically an analogy with linguistics, because mostly in the 19th century, the linguists were focused on what is the historically established use of expressions, the historical patterns of grammar. And then ultimately the conclusion was that it's much better for linguistics not to try to describe what was the historical, because we know that, however, it has very little influence on how the people use the language today. And the function of linguistics is not to be normative and impose the history as the norm of the description, but rather try to describe what is actually happening in the language and what the users of the language do. Now, what I find a little bit challenging to understand why, or what is the reason why we would argue that the historical land use should have implications for how the land is used today. It might be, but I have not seen the reason why this is a good idea. Because I think what matters is what is available now. And of course, it is true that our concepts are what they are, but they evolved for a reason. So I just would like to find an argument, and I could not trace it in your presentation. Why would it be better to go back in the state where the linguistics was basically 1.5 centuries ago and ignore all the fact that the past is interesting to know, but might not have such an important influence and apparently no normative function. So.
Yes, I agree with you. No, there is no reason to coming back to the past. The question is to be sure that what the institutional description of the present correspond to the consideration of local people. In many cases, I could say, I speak about an example that is very interesting because it is a present usurpation. there is an hydroelectric industry that wanted to use a river, and but this river was already used by a local community for the water aqueduct. And what the people of the hydroelectric river made was to damage the other water channel to be able to use all the water, because this channel was a common channel, so of nobody for them. And so what was this? An action of appropriation that is also, in this case, is a problem, of course. But what is the question? That they fought because this is a common land, is of nobody, and so it is also of us, and we could do what we want. This is the problem. There is and the municipality, they say yes, they could. This is a not so clear example, but the question is to consider that there could be different dimension, and maybe the institutional description, it is not the clear representation of the reality, because there could be also other representation, and we have to consider them. I think that it is not useful to come back to the past, but what I see, speaking with people, but also in our present life, that this jurisdictional dimension of our action is something that still works today. Because if I want to claim the right to do something, I try to start to do it in all the things that occur in my life. So it is something that maybe could be useful to consider. It is, I don't know how, but I think that there is as I am an archaeologist, and I'm worried about heritage. We have to think about the future, but also because the institution decide that there are UNESCO sites, there are sites of communitarian interest for the naturalistic value. So if there is an interest to conserve them, we have to think about what to do. But if we just use the economic view, so the productive meaning of the spaces, of the conservation for naturalistic purpose, so the habitat, but we don't think that there are people that should do something, and they are some desire, like territorial justice, for example, and they live in social relationship. We have a partial vision of the problem. So the question is not to come back to the past, but to take into consideration the complexity of the question we have to address in the interpretation of the present and in the interpretation of the past. I think I don't want to come back to the past.
So the point I try to make in archaeological terms, so say if you go to Rome and you see many of the monuments that are like 2,000, 2,500 years old. However, it was also a lesson from our history that even the stones of the Colosseum was systematically recycled for future generations. So why have one particular stretch of history priority over the other? And why don't we take it more like a flow rather than a stage? A flow where different things happen, but the past provides a lot of what we recycle, we reuse, use for repurpose. And in the repurposing is not necessarily constrained by the prior use. So that's all my point.
Yeah. I completely agree. In fact, I think there is a problem that is that the heritage forced to fix the monument in a certain time that was decided by some institution forced to stop this process of reuse that was a local process. And so there is a conflict between the local perspective, that is to use the space in a flux that is continue, with the institutional perspective that is to decide who you have to use or to force to push you to abandon some space because it's not so useful. I speak about rural areas in Liguria that during the 17th and the 60s, people were pushed to go to the coast to work in the industries because they were better. And then we have abandonment in the hills, and we have closed industries because Liguria have no industrial future. So we have two problems: disoccupation, no people, no work, and abandonment. And I agree with you. The question is to live that things goes, and I think it is the problem in the interruption of dialogue that it stop this flux, as you say.
Okay, thank you very much. It's much clearer now.
Okay, we have run out of time. I'm very sorry because it's a really interesting discussion and I think there are more questions, but we're going to have to leave it there. It's certainly been food for thought for me about how the general points that you make relate to my own, because I think they're very general points actually about how our categories and concepts may be very unhelpful in some instances in our own particular areas. So thanks very much for that, and for taking the time to speak to us this morning. Thanks everybody for coming and for participating in an interesting discussion, but we'll have to leave it there. So